Uh, I think this is both an interesting topic and an interesting speaker. Everybody knows about the Montgomery bus boycott, but I, for one, was surprised to read in the newsletter of the Presbyterian Historical Society a couple of years ago that there was a Tallahassee bus boycott. So we'll be hearing about a very interesting man who was involved with that. And our speakers are quite interesting too. David Staniunas is an archivist with the Presbyterian Historical Society in Philadelphia and has been with them since 2011, I think you said.
Yeah.
And he's no stranger to Gainesville because his grandfather was teaching at UF when he was a youngster. And so I'm not going to take any more of his time because what he has to say is really much more important and interesting. So, David, it's all yours.
All right. Richard, thank you very much. Juliana, thank you very much. Folks, thanks for being with us. I'm going to share my screen real quick, duck behind a PowerPoint. Again, my name is David Staniunas. I'm records archivist at the Presbyterian Historical Society. And this is a story about one civil rights activist, one faithful Presbyterian minister who could not but work on the cause of justice. It's a story about how traditions are passed on, about the limits of archival knowledge and power, and it's about how powers sometimes let slip their secrets. In what our friend, the Reverend Cornell Edmonds of New York City, has called an ecclesiastical lynching in late 1957, the Reverend Joseph Metz Rollins left his church, Trinity Presbyterian Church in Tallahassee, Florida. This was recorded the way that all such transfers are recorded. It was entered into a minister's rolling personnel file without incident, mostly without incident. Preparing for this talk, I discovered that Metz Rollins's personnel file actually contains correspondence with his father, Metz Sr., which is a kind of testament to how stable filing practices are in big organizations. Once it's filed, it stays filed, for better or worse. And so we'll start with the family. Metz Jr. was born in 1926 in Newport News, Virginia. His father was the long-serving pastor of Carver Memorial Presbyterian Church, organized in 1892 and reported in 1893 by the Presbytery of Southern Virginia. Southern Virginia was one of the PCUSA's all-Black governing bodies in the South. From Reconstruction until the mid-1980s, the national church integrated at the national level since the late 19th century and gradually and haltingly integrated at the level of the local session beginning in the 1950s. Up through the 1980s, we maintained a separate Black ministry. And this requires taking one more step backwards. In this country, organized Presbyterianism dates to 1706 when the first presbytery was gathered in Philadelphia. This presbytery was 5 guys and Francis McKemmy, an Irish Presbyterian who ran a sloop to Barbados and would ultimately be the largest plantation owner in Accomack County, Virginia, out on the eastern shore. The first free Black Presbyterian congregation in the country was First African Presbyterian Church here in Philadelphia, organized by a former slave from Tennessee named John Gloucester. Enslaved Black people in the South could attend their master's churches, right? Salem Black River in Maysville, South Carolina, Decatur Presbyterian Church in Georgia, and Nassau Presbyterian Church in Princeton all maintained separate balconies expressly for enslaved members of the churches. Other churches had slim wooden pews for seating enslaved people at the back of the church. But the question of ordaining Black men, and it would be Black men until 1974 with the ordination of Katie Geneva Cannon, ordination of Black men was vexing to the North and entirely forbidden in the South until 1880. For much of the 19th century, Presbyterians concerned themselves with how to maintain unity as a denomination within the contradictions of a partly free and partly slave society. Like the society around them, Presbyterians, Old School and New School, Associate and Associate Reformed, there's many different flavors in the 19th century. They broke into three tendencies. There were Presbyterian abolitionists who argued for the immediate end of slavery. Among them, on the left, Henry Highland Garnett of 15th Street Presbyterian Church in Washington, who called for enslaved people to oppose their masters through armed struggle. There were pro-slavers like Benjamin Morgan Palmer in the center of First Presbyterian Church, New Orleans, who held that slavery was divinely sanctioned and an obligation of Christians. It was a form of civilizing mission to African people. And then there were conservatives or meliorists, right, who held that slavery in itself was not a sin, but only the worst parts of slavery were physical abuse, murder, selling people without their knowledge, breaking up families. And these people prayed for an eventual end to the practice. There's a national ferment of abolitionist tendency in the 1830s and 1840s. Lane Seminary students in Cincinnati revolt against their leadership after being told explicitly not to discuss slavery among themselves. And even slaveholding churches like Briery Presbyterian Church in Southside Virginia, which supported itself mainly by jobbing out the people that it owned, debated measures to divest themselves of their chattel. Briery ultimately decided no, they would not, and lost a minister over the deal. And so in 1845, the Presbyterian Church in the USA Old School General Assembly declared that the Church of Christ is a spiritual body. She cannot legislate where Christ has not legislated. And this non-interventionist attitude would ultimately be fully articulated by the guy on the right, James Henley Thornwell of Charleston, South Carolina. Thornwell was an apologist for slavery, one of the most prominent Presbyterian theologians in South Carolina, and he articulated what they called the doctrine of the spirituality of the church, which held that the church has absolutely no interest or affect in temporal affairs. And he would deliver basically the same speech at successive General Assemblies from 1859 until 1861. He wrote, "The state aims at social order, the church at spiritual holiness. The state looks to the visible and outward. The church is concerned for the invisible and inward." And this attitude is like the exact opposite of 20th century theologians like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who said that the body of Christ takes up space in the world. The non-interventionist attitude would predominate in the Presbyterian Church in the South until the 1960s. And this is editorial content. Arguably, that non-interventionist attitude reemerges every time the present denomination is called upon to step out on a ledge for justice. I swear we're getting to Tallahassee, but I want to give you the full context for the civil rights struggle in the church first. So the Civil War divides the two main branches of Presbyterianism, Old School and New School, splits them crossways. And after 1870, there is one sectional church in the South called the Presbyterian Church in the U.S., and then the national church in the North and the West called the Presbyterian Church in the USA. At the end of military reconstruction, Southern whites, of course, retake the levers of power in society and in the church. One example of kind of what went on at the congregational level, the white population of the Presbyterian Church on Edisto Island in South Carolina abandoned the island during the war, and its black population remained. They elected their own session, and they worshipped in the old building, the building built by their former masters, excuse me. With the war ended, the white population returned, elected their own session, and called a minister. And the black church, having managed its own affairs for that long, had no desire to go back to how things ran during slavery time. They started their own church. And there are still two churches of the present day Peace USA on Edisto Island called, confusingly to outsiders, the Presbyterian Church on Edisto Island, and then also Edisto Presbyterian Church, which is a Black church. And so for the first couple of decades after Reconstruction, there was no path toward ordination for Black ministers in the PCUS, the Southern Church. So these new churches of freed people could not be recognized as a presbytery. You can't call your minister. There's no ministers to gather in presbytery. And so the PCUSA, through its Board of Missions to Freedmen, stepped in the breach, supporting Black churches and helping to organize the first all-Black governing bodies. The Presbyteries of Atlantic, centered around Charleston, South Carolina, Catawba around Charlotte, and the Presbytery of Knox, which occupied all of Georgia. Freed Black people organized parochial schools, colleges, seminaries. They educated and ordained ministers and sent missionaries into the world outside of the United States. And so for a couple of generations before Metz Rollins was born, there was an organized and educated Black ministry, so self-sufficient that people raised in it, like Katie Cannon, were surprised to discover that the General Assembly as a whole was majority white. On the left, you have a tilted map of the all-Black synods of the church from 1925, and on the right-hand side is the physics lab at Johnson C. Smith University of Charlotte. That is really the flagship institution of the old Synod of Catawba. So this is the environment and the culture that Metz and his father and his family grew up in. Joseph Metz Rollins Sr. was born in 1900. He was ordained in the Presbytery of Southern Virginia in the Synod of Catawba and served Carver Memorial in Newport News, Virginia for 45 years. His son, Metz Jr., was born in 1926, attended Johnson C. Smith University in Charlotte for his BA and his BDiv, and spent 3 years after teaching religious education at Johnson C. Smith. In 1952, Alex Batchelor of the PCUS Board of Church Extension met the Negro Work Committee of First Presbyterian Church, Tallahassee, Florida, and promised a grant from the board to the church to seed a new Black congregation. A committee drawn from local white churches would take responsibility for fundraising after that. The Tallahassee Committee raised funds in 1953 and 1954 and organized Trinity Presbyterian Church with 32 members, chiefly as a community church and a student center for students at Florida A&M. The church called Metz Rollins as its minister in 1953, and by 1955, Trinity still held worship services in Metz's living room. Ministers in the PCUS Presbytery of Florida were enthusiastic about the idea of church growth, so long as that church growth adhered to segregated society. Dr. Donald Swycord was a PCUS missionary to Korea who had been advocating for church plants in Tallahassee. And by his estimation, from 1945 onward, he writes in the papers that we have here to Angus Laird of the Negro Work Committee in June 1955, one Negro college campus Presbyterian church could by no means meet the needs of the Negro population of Tallahassee. I repeat, we need other Negro Presbyterian churches in Tallahassee if we are to attempt to reach the unchurched Negroes of the area. Laird replies with a summary of the Southern Church's so-called Negro work that is rich with euphemism and myth-making. Laird says, "It is my understanding that for a long time after the war between the states, we did not have separate white and Negro churches. The Negro members, however, preferred their own churches. And finally, about 1876, permission was given by our General Assembly to establish separate Negro churches. However, we insisted upon our usual high educational standards for the Negro ministry, and we did not have ministers meeting our standards." Now, military Reconstruction indeed mandated integration in civil society, and Black attendance at white churches was the norm both before and after the Civil War. The authors of the 1991 PCUSA history, All Black Governing Bodies, that's all in italics, contra Laird, they write that there were not separate Black Presbyterian churches in the South prior to 1876, with one exception, Zion in Charleston, South Carolina. And far from simply preferring their own churches, it was the PCUS refusal to ordain African Americans to the ministry of Word and Sacrament and the revanche of racism post-Reconstruction that drove Black Southern Presbyterians into the new churches being started by the PCUSA. Southerners, again quoting the 1991 history, Southerners expected Blacks to return to their former relationship and be prepared to submit to a status of inferiority in order to worship with their former masters. Segregation would be the official practice in the PCUS until the General Assembly amended its directory for the worship and work of the church in 1964. And so until June 1956, all that stood in the way of Tallahassee Presbyterians supporting the Trinity Church were minor adjustments to the building specifications. At the end of June 1956, news comes into our little file on these events. Angus Laird writes PCUS staff in Atlanta practically sputtering. He complains about the slow growth of Trinity and its failure to be self-sustaining. He encloses a newspaper article attached up on the left there and closes this way. It would be difficult enough to raise the money without the development of the situation referred to in the news story, and it would be impossible to do anything now. Laird was referring to the beginning of Tallahassee's bus boycott. In May of 1956, two Florida A&M students boarded a bus in the whites-only section and refused to move. They were arrested, charged with inciting a riot, and ultimately released. That night, a cross was burned in their front yard. This escalation of violence led Black Tallahasseans to form the Intercivic Council on May 29th, and our man Metz Rollins was its treasurer. He's pictured in this photograph from the Tallahassee Democrat. He's the tall fellow all the way in the back that I've outlined. After a month, the owner of the city bus company, because it was a private company, moved to end bus service altogether, and a June 26th interracial conference meant to try and avert this outcome. White Tallahasseans were as dependent on the bus lines as Black Tallahasseans were. The boycotters were opposed not just by white extremists and white moderates, but they were opposed by members of the nascent, Black bourgeoisie. They were opposed by senior administrators at Florida A&M, including H.M. Efferson, who scolded the boycotters for referring to themselves as second-class citizens. Metz Rollins, for his part, denounced both the patronizing attitude in which the Negroes were being treated like children who had gotten out of line and had to be forced back, and he opposed the moderate desire to return to the status quo ante. He said, "This city will never be the same again. I, for one, would rather see the bus company go than go back to a Jim Crow bus system." The boycott would last 7 months. City Council tried a variety of tactics to pacify the boycotters. City Council appealed to Florida A&M's football coach, Jack Gaither, and a group of friendly Black leaders to help end the boycott. And this only strengthened the resolve of the boycotters to see that they were using divide and conquer type tactics. The bus line hired its first Black drivers in that summer, I think in July, kind of as a token gesture to try to mollify the boycotters. But the bus system refused to integrate the system, which is the one demand of the boycotters. Income for the bus line flattened, and on July 1st, the system just shut down. The people organizing the boycott set up a 65-member carpool to move students and working people around the city beginning that summer. Authorities cracked down on the carpools with, typical picayune infractions. The president of the Intercivic Council, the Baptist minister, C.K. Steele, was the first to get ticketed for allegedly running a stop sign while he had a whole carload of people in the back. The state attorney general, the attorney general of Florida, issued an opinion that the carpools were violating state law about taxis and cars for hire, and 21 drivers in the carpools were arrested on those charges. The ICC, as an organization, was also charged, and the city of Tallahassee issued the 22 defendants $500 fines, and suspended jail time. This was $11,000 in all in fines, which was paid off by a local grocer who was a member of the ICC. For context, that's $125,000 in today's money. The Reverend C.K. Steele is the prominent Baptist minister in Tallahassee, barnstormed around the country for the next few years to pay off the debt. And so our story, gets picked up, and the rest of Metz Rollins' story gets picked up through a fat file on Tallahassee that was contained in the records of the PCUS Division of Negro Work, carefully stewarded in Atlanta, Georgia until about 1988, and then sent to Montreat, North Carolina, which was the Southern Church's archives, and then transferred here in 2006. The file of correspondence was all just maintained as a matter of course. It wasn't like people went out intentionally to try and document the nascent civil rights movement. It just happened to be gathered by accident. And this is pure public records tradition stuff. If you know anything about the variety of traditions in archives, the one that I belong to is the tradition of public records, and my opponents are in the American manuscripts tradition. The record, as it's being created, does not know in advance the outcome of events or the uses that the record's going to be put to. In July 1956, the fellow I mentioned before, Angus Laird of the Presbytery of Florida, began to snoop around Trinity Church's finances, insinuating that Metz Rollins had failed to carefully steward church funds. Ernest Fears, writing on behalf of church leadership, furnished a financial report and a vote of confidence in his minister, writing, "There may be need for some change in the overall leadership of the total organization," arguably meaning the presbytery and the entire denomination, but certainly not in the leadership of Trinity Presbyterian Church proper. I feel that the above church has explicit faith in its present leadership and in no wise it anticipates a change. The Home Mission Committee of Florida Presbytery that fall, as a protest against his organizing work, cut off their salary support for Rollins. Davis Thomas, who was a church member of Trinity's main funder, First Presbyterian Church in Tallahassee, takes Trinity's and Metz Rollins's case before the committee that October, and they said again they would not be interested in supporting the church so long as Metz Rollins was a member of the NAACP. So he was treasurer of the Inner Civic Council, and he was also doing work inside the NAACP. Lawrence Bottoms, future moderator of the PCUS General Assembly, at that point he was staff of the PCUS Board of Church Extension, was dispatched to Tallahassee in November to try and heal the rift. Trinity leadership refused to meet with him. And he wrote back, "It seems now that the idea of the Trinity group is that they do not want to deal with the First Presbyterian Church in Tallahassee or with the Board of Church Extension. All indications are that they will work through the Central Alabama Presbytery." Central Alabama was one of the all-black governing bodies, and so that is who Metz Rollins reported to. Metz Rollins had never been able to maintain his household on Trinity's salary alone. He worked as a hospital orderly to make ends meet, and the sudden loss of Trinity's income endangered the family. By January of 57, Metz's wife Alice wrote to the PCUSA, the national church, their board of national missions, asking for a grant to cover a $1,500 debt. So again, this is something on the order of $15,000 today. What's in the file that we have from the Board of National Missions is the tone of her letter was very understanding and not demanding. That's agency staff who directed her to the emergency fund of the Presbyterian Board of Pensions. BOP still runs an emergency fund, thank God. Further pacification efforts were taken up in February 1957 by Albert Wynn of the Presbytery of Central Alabama, who advised Trinity to reestablish contact with Atlanta, try to mend relations with First Tallahassee, and get in line with Florida Presbytery as soon as possible. By the same token, Wynn advised the angrier members of First Tallahassee the large, rich white church, that their calls for discipline against Rollins were moot. He wrote, in discussing the difficulties which they felt had been introduced into the situation by Mr. Rollins' participation in the bus protest, a clear understanding was reached that Mr. Rollins is a member of the Central Alabama Presbytery and is answerable to that body for any questions which might be raised concerning his conduct as a minister. We felt that this was an important principle to be established, that he has the same rights to his convictions as any other Presbyterian minister. So by May of 1957, seeing no evident way forward, Trinity moved to dissolve its relationship with the PCUS and join the PCUSA. First, Tallahassee would make some final donations to the Department of Negro Work. The PCUS would pay First Tallahassee back what it had spent to hire the architect for Trinity. That was the plans that I showed at the beginning, which never really got off the ground. And the issue would no longer take up the energy of the ecclesial bureaucracy. Metz Rollins was visited in late November 1957 by Arnold Nakajima of the PCUSA Board of Christian Education, describing the turn of events as an ouster. The Board of Christian Education, Division of Social Education and Action, appointed Metz thereafter to a 3-year term as special field representative in areas of racial tension. He started that work in July of 1958. Metz would later serve a multicultural church, an intentionally multicultural church in Nashville, Tennessee. And much later, he would say about that, the salary was $6,000, and I thought I was in glory. He would go on to organize the National Committee of Black Churchmen in New York City, and finally to serve St. Augustine Presbyterian Church in the Bronx. In 25 years at St. Augustine, Rollins would be involved in opposition to the American War in Vietnam, would advocate for prisoners in Attica prison, and would run for the school board in White Plains. In a 2007 History Makers interview, he sounds the same themes in White Plains as animated him in Tallahassee. And he says, they interviewed me and they said, again, the inevitable question, what is it you people want? And I said, I want the same damn thing that you all have. Metz was honorably retired by the Presbytery of New York City in 2005, and he died in 2009. So back in November of 1956, Metz delivered a sermon called Faithful to Christ's Command, which was influential enough that the Synod of Catawba ran it in several sections in the Synod's newspaper called the Argus. The third section was never published, and it was believed lost all the way through 1991. It turns out we had it all along. We had a copy in that file gathered by the PCUS Board of Negro Work. Metz's text is from the Gospel of Mark. If any man would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. And in this text, he appeals to his congregation to take up the cross with him. Laying out their situation, they're members of an all-black and an impoverished presbytery. They are not permitted to join their local presbytery. They are dependent on rich white churches' funds. Those funds are threatened, but they could be restored if their minister gives up work with the ICC and the NAACP. Metz identifies how white supremacy maintains itself. And again, here's some editorial content one more time. White supremacy doesn't maintain itself through billy clubs and water cannons and tear gas, or not alone, not exclusively with those tools and weapons. It maintains itself in committees and small meetings, in correspondence and in checking accounts and double entry ledgers. It's the polite operation of daily business that sustains power. Or if you prefer, it's the soft power of bureaucratic norms that sustains the policeman, the judge, the prison guard, the school principal, and the banker. Metz writes in this sermon, I've seen mission pastors and churches literally sell their souls to sponsoring churches because the minister looked for financial security, and the people rationalized themselves into believing that the only way they could build a church was with the financial aid of white Christians who gave of their substance in such a way as to want their pride and ego fed by poor Negro Christians who had not yet arrived to help themselves. It's a terrible price to pay. He goes on, that's the challenge that Christ offers to Trinity and its minister in this hour. If we can find the strength to deny self and say no to this, we shall do the church a great favor by restoring dignity to the mission church. We shall enable other young ministers to see that serving a mission field does not mean that they cannot be themselves and serve Christ according to their conviction. Furthermore, it ought to awaken our white brethren to their own shortcomings. So, Metz Rollins was not martyred for the cause of Christ. Let's be clear. There are too many martyrs in the civil rights movement to count. He had a long and fulfilling career and a long and fulfilling life, and he influenced ministers who are still around today. But his life in 1956 and 1957 evokes what happens when conscience-driven people, people who seek righteousness, cross over the bounds of polite society and show us the costs of that discipleship. Thanks. That's the end of my text. I can, there are a couple of links that I wanted to pass along in the chat. And I would love to entertain any questions from the audience.
Yes. Well, thank you for a really stimulating, wonderful lecture. I learned a lot and I really enjoyed that. So let's hope we have lots of people in the Oak Room and people on Zoom who want to ask you questions.
Any questions here?
Yeah, and I should have prefaced all of that by saying I feel positive there's probably one Presbyterian in the crowd, and a lot of what I covered was maybe old hat. So I'd like to apologize if anything was, not brand new to you.
Well, we appreciate your time and your presentation. We don't have any questions here. Oh, thanks for sending that.
I'm just gonna pop a couple of links in the chat, and if anybody's interested, there's more to
And David,
learn.
would you mind sending those to me in email, and then I
Yes,
can send them
absolutely.
to the group who were in attendance?
Great. And I'll leave y'all, and Juliana, I'll give you my email address as well.
Perfect. Well, Richard, any final thoughts?
No, I think this is something that we all needed to know about. And he seems like a wonderful guy who did a lot of good right through to old age. But maybe that's an inspiration for all of us, because most of us here are in old age, to continue the fight and continue to work for justice.
Yeah, yeah. The struggle for racial and economic justice inside the Peace USA continues. There's a whole panoply of different resolutions before the General Assembly dealing with how the church uses its money, what the ends of that money are. There are church entities that were organized in response to the Black Power movement in the late 60s, early 70s. There's groups inside the church that were organized around that ferment, but their mandate evolved gradually to include support of everybody who's racialized, minoritized, or impoverished. And we have one really interesting resolution where people are coming to the assembly and saying, no, this was specifically to be like a fund of reparations for people in the African diaspora and descendants of people who endured chattel slavery. So a lot of the questions that were unsettled in the 1950s remain somewhat unsettled in the 2020s. And Metz Rollins's legacy endures. The guy I quoted before is chair of our board. That's Reverend Cornell Edmonds, and he knew Metz in New York, and he described him as an OG. So he's fondly remembered today.
Well, we thank you again for your time, and Richard, thank you for putting this program together, and we look forward to next week with Jacob Gordon.
Yes. We have
All right,
Jake.
thank you, everyone.
Thank you again.
All right, Richard, Juliana, everybody, peace.
Wonderful.
Bye now.